I call them the DB twins.
The
They're going to come up here and ham and egg it a little bit together. Anthony's Director of Client Solutions at DB Schenker. Peter, Head of Retail Supply Chain Solutions. And I think I'll let you guys just kind of kick it off, and then and you've got the final, so you can go. Like I said, you can go 2-3 hours. It's fine.
2-3 hours. And he told me to take all the slides out. First of all, I'd just like to say thanks to CBX for obviously inviting us and giving us the opportunity to speak to you today. I think it's probably fair to say that 2-3 months ago, I think when Tim suggested or floated the idea that we got up and spoke about supply chains, we were very much focused on basic supply chains and what was happening here at Origin. But then as we got into it, we started to realize, actually what's probably going to be more interesting is how supply chains are changing. So actually we started to shift the dynamic within this presentation, which is why it's now become more about basic supply chains to digital innovation. So we're going to take you on a bit of a journey, and then at some point we're going to start to introduce what trends we're seeing as DB Schenker. So we go back in history. So this is the supply chain back in the 1880s. Everything was tailor-made. Sounds a bit like what we've just been talking about with 3D printing and robotics. And of course, the production and supply chain was largely the driver of our industry. It was the driver of innovation. You think about the assembly lines of Fords, then obviously the beautiful shipping containers that we all like to fill and move, especially at Schenker. The more we move, the better. And then obviously into standardization that came about with product codes, and then into the continuous replenishment. So all of these things are not new. We're kind of used to these, but the manufacturing drove that. Mass production drove that innovation. And then if we fast forward to today, you know, pop-up stores start to show, Apple starts to introduce mobile scanners at checkouts. You look at Starbucks launching mobile apps. It suddenly became really important that we knew that our pizza was in the oven and it was going to be delivered in 20 minutes. We suddenly needed this sort of innovation in the supply chain, and obviously the visibility platforms that we've talked quite a bit about today. And then of course, the rise of multi-channel to omni-channel, and what does that mean from a supply chain point of view, and how we're holding inventories and stocks and where we position those stocks. And then of course, through to new shops coming out by Amazon with there's nobody in them. So as my boss says, that used to be called shoplifting, but now we can kind of go in and just pick our own stock off the shelves. And then of course, moving on now into obviously how do we put more stock in our stores or online that we don't necessarily source and buy directly for ourselves. And Tesla obviously recently announced electric trucks, and I think last week also switched on the largest battery in the world in Australia. So I think the thing here is it's speed as well. So every single presentation today has talked about speed, and we're going to touch on that a lot today through our PowerPoint about what we're seeing. So in terms of what's the impact of all of this, so over the last 20 years or so, it's probably true that we're all experiencing some sort of seismic shift, whether you're in retail or supply chain. And if you consider that Amazon, when it was really launched in '97, the average age was about 16, and they're all in their mid-30s with lots of money to spend, and it's really fueling and driving that sort of growth. Anyone have an AOL account still? No? that was probably the first one everyone had. And of course, delivery was really sometime soon. Deliver now maybe in 3 weeks, and that just doesn't cut it today, especially if you want your pizza. And then you look at today, and it's you look at Amazon. It's now in the top 10 retailers globally. The largest detailer, Alibaba. We all know about Alibaba, and it's 25 billion in one day. And of course, new entrants to the market with Google and Yahoo. No one knows who AOL is anymore unless you're our age. And social media obviously dominates. And the more and more the social media penetrates our society, you see them actually being converted now into even shops. So anyone who's used WeChat in China lately will know exactly what I mean by that. And of course, it spawned new business models. So this is nothing new. Everybody's seen this before. Airbnb has no assets, and Uber has no assets, and Alibaba largely has no real assets, but they're still the largest retail platform. They're the largest taxi company. And of course, being in DB Schenker, we're kind of looking over our shoulder. Who's going to be in the largest platform in freight? Because it's already happening. So it's already possible for companies to broker warehousing and truck space online, bid and auction off space. We're starting to see this coming into the shipping industries as well. And we're also going to talk a little bit later about how we see this going into future predictive analytics on freight rates, and we'll give you an insight into some of the platforms that are actually starting to come out, which is really starting to challenge, I suppose, the more mature legacy type freight forwarders of the past, of which we are obviously one of them. So we need to adapt and we need to change. In terms of obviously the market, we won't go through all this, click and collect. So this is nothing new, especially if you're in the US or the UK, but actually in some markets it's still quite new. So if you go across into Southeast Asia, these are really emerging, but they're getting there fast. And the jumping technology, I think in the previous panel, someone referred to these nations are jumping in technology and passing over evolutions and going straight to the front. So you're starting to see expanded service offerings with endless aisles. So that creates complications into the supply chain. How do we get visibility of stock that's maybe not in our supply chain or in our DC, it's in somebody else's, but I still want to sell it. I still want to have access to it. And of course, this spawns a whole new industry. We've talked a lot about it today with analytics, machine learning, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few slides about what we see. And of course, probably speed is the thing that comes with this. So we had several conversations only yesterday where retailers are actually talking to us more about speed than cost, which from a service provider's point of view is kind of rare, to be honest. I think in the last 6 to 8 months, it's the number one question. Not as in collaboration and how low can you go. It's all about how fast can you get it there. Cost is still important, don't get me wrong, but it's not actually always the number one question anymore. It's definitely speed. And then for larger retailers who are maybe more online and in multiple countries, we're getting more and more questions asked about how to position stock, how to respond quickly, where should it be, how can we drive inventories down across the whole supply chain while still servicing our customers in an efficient way. So these are sort of the questions that we're getting a lot of right now, and it's really being fueled through the speed and analytics and the desire to transact online. So I won't read all of this out, I just talked to some of the themes for you. So in terms of conventional, I think if you look at the top, and I think you can't read it because I've been sat at the back, conventional supply chains and forwarding opportunities. The top boxes effectively represent origin type services, whether you're consolidating, whether you're splitting your stock, whether you're splitting between countries, different ports, whether you're adding any sort of value here, whether you want to do quality or ticketing or something. So they're what I would say are conventional freight forwarding offerings. And of course, into the transition in terms of ocean, air, trucking, rail now are China increasingly. And then obviously the destination services, all underpinned by some sort of visibility platform. I think there probably isn't a global forwarder out there that can't offer you all of those. So what we want to do is just talk about, well, what's building in market presence. So the middle layer here talks about things that are growing in presence in terms of not necessarily new, but certainly the level of interest is peaking. And what we're seeing here is trying to get more involved on the analytics and optimizing network flows. So we have obviously access to a lot of software systems that can help model and optimize. That's almost insatiable right now in terms of what people are looking to do. And again, it's just about speed. It's about what can we do. Sourcing, so how can we help? So you guys have talked a lot today, and how do we speed up the sourcing process? How do we get it to market faster? And obviously we're part of that whole question. Surprisingly, photography is another one that's moving increasingly more to Asia. So this will be dependent on if you're a retailer that's trading online. What they're trying to do is they're moving product photography into Asia primarily for obviously getting web store images up and running faster. So whilst product is in transit, the images are online and already transacting and selling. If you're an international retailer that's in multiple markets, then obviously the advantages of not having to wait for that stock to get to the home market, it can already be online. So we're seeing this actually coming back into the fulfillment centers within Asia. And there's probably about 3 or 4 forwarders that are really strong in this space. So maybe a little surprising that forwarders are getting involved in marketing, but it's speed. They just want speed. It's about how can you provide that service. And then of course, we're even now starting to get engaged in e-commerce and web store hosting, which again seems a real strange service offering for a freight forward that would traditionally be into warehouses, trucks and ships. Now we're getting involved in web store hosting. How do we provide inventory visibility and then service those sort of platforms in many different ways? So if that's kind of what's on the horizon and being delivered and executed now, the last box is the future in sight. So not a million miles away. In some markets, it's actually already happening. So optimized sourcing using data analytics, FTAs, duties, real time. So I'm going to show you a slide in a few minutes, which talks about how we take HS code type data, sourcing data, and map that on a global scale to see where products are actually being made and shipped. And therefore, if we're working with you, we can then overlap your data to sort of a global market. So from my days of running a buying office, it was always quite hard to truly get good data on understanding where things are actually made. And of course, you then, with the ability to analyze data in different ways today, bringing in FTA agreements, duty information, shipping information, and all of those sort of added value costs that go into that supply chain, we're now actually able to start really helping inform sourcing organizations on where's the best place to source from a total cost per product, not just from an item cost level. So this sort of analytics is coming along, and we're already doing this sort of stuff. Looking ahead in terms of, I think we don't really need to talk too much about autonomous vehicles and those sort of things. AI, we've already covered a lot. Internet of Things and robotics, we're going to talk about in a few minutes, about what's coming along and what sort of trends we see. Drones, we have a debate, we don't agree. So I think in the panel there was a discussion that mentioned drones, that saw that as being a possible future for deliveries being made by drones at some point. I very much stand in that camp. My colleague Peter does not. So challenge him a little bit later. Yeah, it's but I can see some real applications for it. I was at a conference last week with KPMG, and they informed us that JD.com had just bought 200,000 drones. And then in reaching out to JD.com to find out a little bit more, they're not actually going to use drones in the cities so much. That's not actually where they're going to use it. They're looking to target China at rural villages. They see the opportunity for drones to reduce the cost of the supply chain by servicing the rural areas of China. So if you think about China, I think there's something like 700 million people towards the east side of it. So they're actually tackling quite a big portion of the population. And if they're able to actually service those rural areas using drone technology, I think it could be a real winner for them from a cost-saving perspective. I see more challenges in a high-rise building, but a little bit easier to serve a farm maybe, or a rural village. So the traffic. Which is a real clever idea, yeah? You can really see the benefit of that. So you can see how drones may not necessarily be deployed in the way that we envisage it today as being a sort of a home delivery solution. But it definitely has a part to play, and yes, I think there are other applications that can be considered. So my colleague doesn't agree, but we'll see, yeah? I think we'll know within 12 months. I think these things are moving that fast. So what we wanted to do is just jump into a few little things. So we're going to cover off in a little bit more detail these sort of things. So I'll cover off analytics and how we're visualizing data, and Peter will pick up one-day infantry, how we're going to do that, AI again, and robotics, and then I'll just close it out at the end. So in terms of using analytics, so this is where we talked before about work that we're doing. So we have an innovation lab in, I think it's in Essen in Germany, and we're working with our innovation team on pulling together large data sets. So if you imagine a company of our size, all the customs brokerage that we do, pulling all of that information together with the sole purpose of trying to understand how things are made from a global perspective. So we're already pulling this in. We're able to map geographically. In this case, I just took a popular example, which is a knitted T-shirt. So most people have sourced that at some point in their time. And just to give an idea of where things are sourced, and then what we can then do is actually then start to map that as to where it's going. So which countries are sourcing from which locations. So obviously, if you're in America, you might want to access more of the Latin American countries as opposed to maybe a European. So there are different dynamics in terms of where things are sourced and where they go to. So we're actually able to map that, and then what we then do is with our customers, we're able to overlap their own data and then provide insights back to the retailer saying, okay, well, other people in a similar sort of demographic geographically to you are actually sourcing in these sort of regions, and you're not necessarily in there today. So it gives them an opportunity of where to go and look, and maybe help with investment strategies around, do I want to buy an office there? Do I want a branch or some sort of setup? How do I choose where to go? So it helps them understand on understanding these sort of things. So we're getting more and more on this, and then obviously linking that into the total landed cost. In terms of analytics and how we visualize them, I think it's nothing so new how we visualize analytics. I think what's new is all the data sources that come into it. So I think somebody earlier on talked about having too much data, and then how do I make sense of all of that data? So we've got teams now just basically looking at how we develop analytics that provide meaningful information that's very visual but drillable at the same time. So you don't need huge amounts of spreadsheets to actually uncover what's going on. And of course, deliver information in a way that it's useful. So I don't need to know if I've got 1,000 containers moving, what's happening to 1,000. I just need to know what's happening to the one that's not on time, or the one that's early or late. So we deliver information in this way. And we're also seeing lots of platforms starting to obviously tackle this sort of field. So at the bottom here, in this graphic here, this is actually a screenshot of a company called Sonata. So I don't know if you're familiar with Sonata. Excuse me, getting a cold. So Sonata is a platform that is actually providing predictive analytics on future ocean rates. And it does it quite well, scarily well. So they're moving, last time I spoke to them, they're moving around about 7 or 8 million containers of data on their platform. They're actually physically, what they do is they'll talk to retailers like yourself, and they'll ask you to populate the data sets with what you're buying your freight at. And if you've contracted out in the future, what is it at? And when you aggregate all of that data together from all of the retailers that they're working with across the world, they can actually start to predict what the ocean rates are in the future. So traditionally people have used the Shanghai Index, which is very historical and retro looking, but this is just purely looking out by trade lane and able to predict quite well. So imagine as those guys get bigger and bigger and start putting more and more data into here, just how tight that will become. So these are real disruptors for our industry, because obviously we're in the industry of trying to make money from selling freight as well. So this is going to make everything very transparent and very open, very accessible. It's not expensive to access. So a big disruptor coming our way. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Peter, who's going to take you through what we're seeing with Walmart.
So What I want to really do is highlight a couple of trends that we're seeing and what the actual implications are. Because we all know AI is here, we all know that's going to do, but what does it mean from a supply chain perspective? You know, and I think a lot of people have forgotten about this. There's some really cool stuff happening with drones and all this sort of stuff, but what's the real implication? And one of my favourite ones is I was at CSCMP conference in Atlanta earlier this year. It's the biggest logistics conference in the world. And Walmart, who very rarely participate in this conference, were sprouting, we are heading for 1 day of inventory. Okay? Now, everyone talks about speed in the supply chain. I'm going to give you another word that's going to be the most critical one: precision. Okay? We now have customers that penalise us if we're early. You know, in my day, early's good, big pat on back, did good job. Now, the customer says, that's my profit, because I've got to hold it for 1 day more than I want it. Okay? So it all becomes precision. We're also, I mean, the implication too is we're going to be doing, and I think earlier on we're talking about smaller order quantities. We're going to be doing lots more purchase orders, lots more. And that's going to make your buying offices much bigger, because, you know, instead of doing, I don't know what the productivity for a buyer is per purchase order, but they're going to be doing sometimes daily purchase orders for the same product. So your relationships with your suppliers are going to be very different, you know, because those purchase orders are going to be much smaller. We are going to see a lot more nearshore replenishment, and, you know, the reality is people are not going to invest in warehouses anymore. They're too expensive, and they're inefficient. So a lot of that efficiency is coming back to Asia. Okay, just want to hit a couple of key things. I'm sure a few of you have heard about the Otto Group. So they are now, it's a German retailer, and they are now with 90 to 95% precision predicting what they're going to sell in 30 days. So they know I'm going to buy a pink umbrella before I do, which is pretty bizarre when you think about it. But again, what that drives is supply chain precision. They will literally be doing daily purchase orders, and that product has to arrive on Tuesday because it's going to get sold on Wednesday. So again, we're not talking in our game. We're not talking freight rates anymore. Is what is the most cost-effective method to get my product to there on that day? Okay, so if it's 70 days, we can use ships, or if it's whatever, we've got rail options, air sea options, etc. But it becomes precision, not so much speed, precision. It has to be there on that day. Okay. It also means that we've always been talking about visibility in the supply chain. This is real supply chain management. I think earlier, Jack was saying, there is so much data and stuff like that. I call it red box management. All I want is, I've got a problem. I've got a red box. What do I need to do to fix that red box? Okay. I don't care about the green boxes. They're irrelevant. Just give me the 3 that I've got a problem. If you've got 30, you've got a bad day. I like my email queue to have no red boxes. Okay. And again, managing only the exceptions. But again, we get one chance to get it right. Okay. I would also argue now in the supply chain that on-shelf availability is not an issue, because we're doing so many changes of product anyway, people don't know it's not there. Okay, so again, we get some interesting side stories in that. Now, I'm going to touch on Amazon because, for reasons that you probably won't agree, I actually don't believe Amazon will be the massive success that everyone, more than it is. I think it's got limitations. I think it's actually, my argument is that you go to Walmart to buy, you don't shop there. And that they are now competing with Walmart. But the one thing that Amazon has done is made us, our expectations have changed. We used to wait 2 weeks to get stuff. Now, I lived in the US for the last 5 years. I got so lazy that I wouldn't even buy highlighter pens. I've got Amazon Prime. I'd go online, order three. I only use yellow highlighter pens. It's the idiosyncrasy. I'd order 3 pens. They'd be delivered the next day for $2.39. Okay, that's just unbelievable. But that is the expectation of the market now. Interestingly, though, Prime is just opening up in Singapore, and it is not going to be free delivery. Okay, they're going to charge you for it. So, you know, I think even Amazon have realised that free deliveries has some issues. Their net cost of delivery last year was $1 billion they spent on delivery in the US. So there is, at some point in time, someone's got to pay for it. Okay, and 1 billion is a big number. Okay, that's really just a couple of ideas. I mean, I think the broad sense I want to get through to people is we are going to be doing a lot more purchase orders. Those purchase orders are going to be managed in extreme detail. You can have a lot of visibility about it, and you're going to have to. It's going to be so much data that you can only manage the exceptions. The other thing is speed is important, but precision is essential because you can't miss that day. You're not going to have 27 or 30, 50 days of inventory. When I started in this industry, 60 days inventory was considered reasonable. You think Walmart have 100 DCs in the US. If they go to 1 day of inventory, they're going to be really small warehouses. Okay, they're cross stocks. You know, it changes the whole dynamic. But the cost, they have to do it to get the cost down. So it'll be an interesting time. The Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. So we live in interesting times. Okay, that's just my little piece.
Okay. So I'll just finish off for you first, guys. Just on Amazon, the thing that I kind of like about this graphic a little bit is it kind of nicely identifies the different ways that they supply. When you talk to people, I think that there's a general perspective that they have big warehouses and everything's in them, and it's just simply not the truth. They have different methodologies for servicing the individual customer at home, depending on where you are located and how you're located in relation to their supply chain. And of course, whether you're actually buying their stock or partner stock. So it's an interesting graphic. I think that increasingly more and more retailers will start needing to adopt different methodologies on how to service its customer rather than through a traditional sort of warehouse or click and collect type models. I think they're going to need to start being a little bit more agile than they are right now today. I think there's some they're adopting, but really when you think about the mass amount of retailers that are out there, there's still quite a lot really in a more conventional methodology. And I think that's where they're going to have to fight in the future. We're going to just close out with a final slide, which was touched on in the previous panel, really, about 3D printing and robotics. So I think most people, when you talk to them about robotics, they think of this little man in the top corner. They kind of think of a person with arms and legs, but actually within the supply chain industry, within the warehousing, actually we call robotics often don't take this sort of shape. We've got quite a lot of robotics deployed in the warehouse that we just commissioned in Sweden, which is focused on e-commerce fulfillment. And really the robots are moving shelves around. They're actually picking up entire shelves full of stock and delivering them to a person who's then able to take the stock off the shelf. And robots are being used in this way because one is I can actually get more stock in my warehouse if I don't need aisles for forklift trucks and people spaces. I can totally rack this entire area, and I use robots to bring the stock to people. So you see robots being deployed now within warehouse environments, particularly in e-fulfillment warehouses where, yet again, speed is the key. And of course, driving down that cost is all important if I'm going to now deliver to the home. The other areas we see is obviously in unloading of vehicles, loading of vehicles, automatically moving containers. So if you're a retailer that has large container yards, like when I had on average 500 containers in my yard. We would obviously have large mechanical handling equipment to move all of that. Well, now that's moving into the world of robotics. And then of course you'd be familiar with these two retailers up here, Adidas. So Adidas some time ago obviously opened up their speed factory. They're moving into small MOQs. Imagine Adidas making only 500 pairs at a time. That's pretty impossible. I remember when I was sourcing going into an Adidas factory in Cambodia, asking if I could use their production facilities. And I was told if you buy 500,000 pairs, no problem. So now they're down to 500, which is incredible when you think about it. And it's becoming more and more personalized and more and more customized to the individual. Most of you will know that you can go into any Adidas or Nike shop and pretty much customize a pair of shoes. What they're starting to do now is convert that into some sort of 3D printing technology, deploy it on a nearshore operation, and then give it to you within 5 to 10 days. So I think it was yourself earlier on suggested that maybe 3D printing and reducing that lead time to maybe 10 to 15 days is exactly where Nike and Adidas are right now on their footwear. And then of course, you know, in true sense, we like data, so even our shoes give data. So Adidas are now actually applying chips into their future footwear. So they're using near field technology chips to start tracking your personal data. So obviously they'll be bringing out an app in the future which tells you all about your nutrition and your habits. And I'm sure we will hit lots of downloads. And then of course Nike, I think quite recently announced that they were setting up a factory in America. They were going to set up 1,200 robots, and that's primarily for the production and assembly of footwear. So they're already dabbling in this space. They're already moving into this space. So you look at when I spoke to New Balance and Under Armour a couple of months ago at Reeler in America, they were already talking about how they've already started to follow their competition and moved into 3D printing of soles and shoes. So I think in one of the presentations early on, they talked about the lady did a survey. I think her name was Lynn. Sorry, yeah. I was quite surprised also when the respondents said that they didn't think near sourcing was going to be that big a deal in the future. When you look at these sort of organizations that are already investing quite heavily into this space, I think it's going to come quicker than we think. Yeah. And I think that's me. Thank you.